It doesn't begin with a battlefield. It begins with a ledger. Winter light across a village square, officials arriving not as raiders but as clerks, quiet, methodical, carrying leather-bound books. Names become entries, ages become figures. A 7-year-old who yesterday was simply a child with a favorite corner of the hearth is suddenly a number that fits a quota. The process is framed as policy, organized by schedules and routes, measured against the empire's needs. Nothing about it is accidental. This is a system that treats human lives like logistics, who is taken from where and for what future role, all anticipated in neat handwriting long before footsteps reach the door. Families know what the books mean. Doors close softly. Prayers are whispered quickly. Some bargain for time, others hide what cannot be hidden. The officials, trained to speak with courtesy and to remain unmoved by tears, recite the same lines in every village and then continue on. A procession forms, boys placed in rows, guided forward with firm instruction and the promise that they will serve something larger than themselves. They are instructed to keep order. They are told to look ahead. They are told to forget the road behind. The logic is simple and cold. With careful selection and training, the state can build a dependable future. Soldiers who march in step, servants who know their tasks, administrators who can be trusted to carry orders without question. This was not a rumor, nor a shadow network. It was policy that filled halls with reports and sealed archives with stamped approvals. A system refined by trial and error, memoranda and revisions, each year producing results that could be summarized in numbers. How many collected, how many assigned, how many advanced, how many lost. In practice, the selection was exacting. Officials preferred certain ages, certain regions, certain traits that, on paper, predicted success. Villages received quotas calculated from population and past yields. Inspectors compared lists against faces and families. They ticked boxes, confirmed details, and moved on. If an uprising flared, the response was not to reconsider the system, but to tighten procedures, preventing disputes over counts and eligibility. To read the surviving paperwork is to see the mindset, human futures treated as statistics to be improved. And behind those numbers are rooms where silence is the rule, where boys are taught to stand in straight lines, where language lessons begin the first afternoon. It is here that the real transformation starts, not with chains but with routine. New names are assigned. Old words are discouraged, then forbidden. The day's rhythm is standardized: learning, exercise, instruction, prayer, rest, uniform garments, uniform meals, uniform tasks. The goal is not simply obedience, but a fresh identity that will align perfectly with the state. Supervisors speak of progress and potential. The best learners are praised, the hesitant are corrected. Over weeks, the familiar fades. Over months, the past becomes something carried only in quiet glances and in the memory of a lullaby that now has no words. If you value stories that unmask the machinery behind empires, the policies, the paperwork, the cool logic that reshapes lives, stay with this series. There's more to uncover, and every detail matters. The transformation was designed to be gradual, but absolute. From the moment a boy entered the system, he was no longer defined by family or village, but by role and expectation. His old name was carefully replaced with a new one, written in records that erased any trace of where he had come from. The officials who managed this process called it education, but its purpose was far more calculated. Every lesson, every schedule, every new word in a foreign language chipped away at the identity the child once carried. The first weeks were the hardest, small voices whispering in their native tongue when guards were absent, fleeting glances between those who remembered each other's homes. But the system allowed no room for attachment. Language rules were strict. Rewards came only when boys adapted quickly, punishments when they clung too long to what was behind them. In time, even memories felt blurred, reshaped by routine. The architecture of training compounds reinforced this sense of disorientation. Vast dormitories filled with identical beds, narrow corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly. No familiar symbols, no reminders of their former faith or traditions, not even a view of the landscapes they once knew. The environment was intentionally unfamiliar, forcing dependence on the new rhythms imposed by the institution. Small groups were formed, with older boys assigned as brothers, supervisors as fathers. It created a new family structure that replaced the one each child had been torn from. Bonds grew not by choice, but through necessity. For many, those artificial ties became their only source of comfort in a world that demanded complete conformity. The system's strength lay in its bureaucracy. Records were meticulous. Names, ages, origins, health, progress, all written in detail. To the administrators, these were not lives, but figures in a ledger. Quotas had to be met. Performance was measured. Adjustments were made. If one region provided recruits who excelled in mathematics or physical training, collectors returned there with greater enthusiasm the following year. If another region resisted, penalties were imposed. The empire's needs dictated the shape of childhoods, and every boy's future was decided long before he had a chance to dream it for himself. Some adapted quickly. Those who learned new languages fast, who excelled in studies, who demonstrated loyalty to their instructors, advanced into privileged tracks. They became pages in palaces, attendants in treasuries, administrators trusted with sensitive responsibilities. Others were directed into military training, molded into soldiers whose lives would be defined by discipline and battle. A few never adjusted. For them, the system had no patience. They were reassigned to lesser tasks, their resistance recorded as failure in documents that would outlive them. The machine had no space for individuality, no mercy for those who could not bend. The most chilling realization is how normal it all became. Reports were submitted annually, calmly noting figures, praising efficiency, recommending adjustments. Officials treated this system not as cruelty, but as governance. It was discussed in the same tone as tax collection or agricultural quotas. And yet, behind each number in those neat ledgers was a child who once had a name, a mother, a village that waited for a return that would never come. Stay with this story. What unfolds next reveals not only how lives were reshaped, but how entire generations became tools of a state that measured its power not just in soldiers or wealth, but in the erasure of memory itself. By the time months turned into years, the boys who had once resisted the hardest often found themselves speaking fluently in the new language, reciting prayers and codes of loyalty as if they had always belonged to this world. What had once been foreign, clothing, speech, routines, became second nature. That was the aim of the program, not to suppress identity temporarily, but to replace it entirely. Those who excelled were rewarded with privileges, a blanket in winter, extra bread, or a chance at education that promised higher status. It was a system that turned survival into competition, making boys fight to abandon their pasts more quickly than their peers. The rewards created a hierarchy within the training grounds. Some rose quickly, admired by their instructors, singled out as models of progress. Others fell behind, struggling to keep pace, weighed down by memories that refused to vanish. The records show just how effective this process was. In a single generation, boys taken from distant villages could rise to become powerful officials within the empire, carrying out the same system that once had claimed them. It was a cycle of transformation. Those who had been reshaped became the enforcers, perpetuating the structure with unquestioned loyalty. Routine was the weapon that broke resistance. Days were carved into precise segments, rising before dawn, group prayers, lessons in reading and writing, physical drills, evening recitations, and regulated sleep. The rhythm was relentless. Over time, the sheer repetition dulled memories of earlier life. When exhaustion silences the mind, recollections fade into fragments like dreams upon waking. And in their place came a new narrative, one where the empire was not captor, but guardian, where the sultan was not distant ruler, but a kind of father. The psychological impact reached beyond the children themselves. Entire communities bore the weight of absence. Mothers who had once filled homes with song carried silence instead. Fathers who taught their sons trades were left with empty workshops. Villages spoke in hushed tones of the day officials came, of the names checked off lists, of the sons who would never again walk their fields. Folklore preserved fragments of grief, songs that mourned, proverbs that warned, lullabies that ended in sorrow. Generations lived with an unspoken wound, the absence of children shaping not just families, but cultures. Yet from the perspective of the empire, the system was hailed as one of its greatest successes. Reports praised the loyalty and discipline of those who had been collected. Foreign observers marveled at the strength of soldiers who had once been unwilling recruits. Diplomats noted the efficiency of a structure that seemed to transform children into instruments of state power with mechanical precision. To rulers and officials, this was evidence not of cruelty, but of effective governance. They saw ledgers balanced, quotas met, outcomes achieved. What makes this history so unsettling is not only the suffering it produced, but the way it was normalized. It did not happen in shadows, but in broad daylight, administered by clerks and bureaucrats who believed they were simply fulfilling their duties. Paperwork masked pain. Numbers concealed names. And so the machine continued, year after year, until generations had passed through it, leaving behind only faint traces in archives and folk memory. The deeper we look, the more we see that this was not merely an episode of history. It was a template for how power, once institutionalized, can turn lives into statistics. And it forces us to ask, how many other systems, praised as efficient, conceal stories just as haunting beneath the surface? What began as paperwork soon hardened into permanence. Once a child was entered into the system, there was no reversal. The path ahead was mapped out with precision, leading either to military service, palace duties, or administrative positions. Each boy's abilities were scrutinized, their talents measured against the empire's demands. Tall stature could determine a future with the elite soldiers. A sharp mind might send one to the treasury or the court schools. A steady hand or graceful bearing could open a path to service within noble households. Whatever their individual qualities, their destinies were no longer their own. The empire's administrators called this progress. They saw value in transforming children from distant provinces into loyal instruments of state power. The irony was profound. The very people whose families mourned their loss could one day return as officials representing the system that had taken them. Many did. Some became generals, others governors. Their loyalty was no longer to the villages of their birth, but to the empire that had remade them. This, above all, reveals the chilling efficiency of the process. It did not merely remove children, it rewired allegiance itself. The uniformity of life inside training centers left little space for individuality. Meals were identical, portions measured carefully. Clothing was standard issue, designed less for comfort than for sameness. Even gestures and postures were monitored. Instructors corrected how boys walked, how they spoke, how they held themselves in public. Every detail became part of an education in obedience. Resistance was not crushed by brutality alone, but by 1,000 small corrections that slowly replaced spontaneity with predictability. Foreign observers who visited the empire often remarked on this precision. Ambassadors recorded their impressions of boys who moved with mechanical grace, speaking with rehearsed confidence, behaving with a discipline that astonished outsiders. What they rarely saw, however, was the cost. the silence of memories buried, the weight of homes forgotten. For those within the system, the absence of choice became a condition of life. A boy who once ran through orchards or fields could now march for hours in perfect formation, his childhood erased as if it had never been. And yet, even within this machinery, humanity sometimes flickered. A shared glance between recruits who remembered the same village, a whispered word in a forbidden language, a song hummed quietly at night before sleep. These fragments of the past did not disappear entirely. They lingered, fragile and hidden, reminders that identity, though reshaped, could never be fully destroyed. The administrators wrote of success rates and efficiency, but the truth is that no system, however strict, can fully erase the memory of a home once loved. Still, the overwhelming story is one of continuity. The empire's need for order, soldiers and servants, meant that this system endured across centuries. It was adjusted, refined, improved in bureaucratic terms. Better record-keeping, clearer criteria, stricter supervision. Each generation of officials congratulated themselves on managing it more effectively. And through it all, boys continued to be taken, families continued to grieve, and entire regions lived under the shadow of quotas that measured children as resources. The lesson is clear. When power becomes a system, it justifies itself endlessly. What began as necessity became tradition, and what began as cruelty became routine. That is why this story matters, because it reveals not only what was done, but how ordinary people accepted it, recorded it, and passed it on as if it were simply the way the world was meant to be. Centuries of repetition gave the system an air of inevitability. Villagers learned to expect the officials, just as they expected the changing of the seasons. Rumors would ripple ahead of their arrival, lists prepared, quotas whispered, strategies devised to delay the inevitable. Some parents tried bargaining with bribes, scraping together gold in hopes of sparing a son. Others hurried to arrange early marriages, believing the law would protect the newlywed. But the empire adapted. When exemptions were exploited too often, rules were rewritten, and what once offered escape soon vanished. The machine adjusted faster than families could. In this way, fear seeped into everyday life. Births of boys brought as much anxiety as joy. Parents looked at newborn sons, not only with love but with dread, wondering if they would survive long enough to remain part of the family. Songs and lullabies carried this unease. Folklore remembered the grief of mothers, their voices weaving sorrow into verses that endured long after the events themselves. Even when the words were softened into poetry, the weight of absence was unmistakable. Communities that lost generation after generation could not help but carry the scars. Meanwhile, the empire praised the program's results. Soldiers produced through this system became some of the most disciplined in the world, their loyalty unwavering, their training unmatched. Administrators rose from humble origins to hold high positions, proof, so the empire claimed, of opportunity and merit. On the surface, it was a story of advancement, but beneath, it was the tale of stolen lives reshaped for purposes never chosen. The grandeur of military parades and palace ceremonies concealed the private pain of families who never saw their children again. The most haunting truth is how ordinary it all seemed to those who ran it. Officials tallied quotas as calmly as they measured harvests. Clerks filed reports on boys as if they were recording grain shipments. In this normalization lies the deepest warning. Atrocity does not always come wrapped in chaos and noise. Sometimes it comes in ink, on paper, with signatures and stamps. The banality of it, the way cruelty can be disguised as administration, is what gives the story its chilling resonance even centuries later. And still, traces remain. In archives, ledgers list names now weathered by time. Each line is a reminder that behind the efficiency were individuals with homes, families, and dreams. Some of those children rose to prominence, their names celebrated in chronicles, but most were forgotten, remembered only in the grief of the communities that lost them. Their stories lie buried in songs, in folklore, in faint echoes passed from one generation to the next. To understand this chapter of history is to recognize how power can institutionalize loss until it feels inevitable. It is to see how ordinary people, by following orders or maintaining records, become part of something that reshapes lives on an unimaginable scale. And it is to remember that even the most efficient systems can carry within them immense cruelty, hidden behind the appearance of order. If you've followed this far, take a moment to reflect. These stories matter because they remind us how fragile freedom can be when bureaucracy gains more weight than humanity. And if you want to uncover more hidden truths like this one, stay with us, because history's darkest systems often hide in plain sight, waiting to be exposed.